You might think, Cubism. Those iconic fragmented portraits, the muted palettes, that revolutionary breaking down of reality.
Right.
Perhaps your mind immediately conjures images of, say, Pablo Picasso or Georges Braque, and you'd be right to do so. They are, after all, the movement's celebrated pioneers.
Absolutely, the big names.
But what if I told you that the story of Cubism is far richer, far more global, and honestly filled with even more surprising discoveries than you've ever imagined? Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into Cubism, specifically venturing beyond its Parisian origins. We want to explore how this groundbreaking style was embraced, reinterpreted, and profoundly reshaped by artists in different countries.
Often in really personal ways, too.
Exactly, often in incredibly personal and culturally significant ways. Our mission really is to reveal how this influential style wasn't just imitated, but creatively transformed.
Yeah, to show its far-reaching impact.
And uncover those rich aha moments you find in unexpected corners of the art world. We'll try to unpack the different philosophies, techniques, and, well, cultural integrations that made Cubism a truly global phenomenon.
That's right. It's easy to forget that for centuries, art aimed to create the illusion of a three-dimensional world on a flat canvas, mimicking what we see with our own eyes.
The whole Renaissance perspective thing.
Exactly. That approach dictated a fixed viewpoint, inciting you, the viewer, to look through the canvas as if it were a window into another space.
Like looking at a scene?
Precisely. Cubism, which popped up in Paris between about 1907 and 1914, completely dismantled that centuries-old tradition, just took it apart.
So it wasn't about recreating reality from that single, fixed viewpoint.
Not at all. It was about emphasizing the two-dimensional canvas itself, showing multiple perspectives at once, and truly making you engage with how vision and perception actually work.
So it challenges that whole idea of the painting as just a window.
Fundamentally, it challenged the assumption that a painting is merely a window onto an illusory, optically similar space. So we're going to unpack how this radical idea traveled.
How it spread out.
Right, and how it transformed in the hands of artists who infused it with new meaning, new color, even new mathematical rigor.
Making it relevant to their own worlds.
Their own unique cultural and philosophical landscapes, exactly.
Yeah.
This deep dive will truly reveal how Cubism wasn't just copied, it was creatively transformed, showing its, well, astonishingly far-reaching impact.
Okay, let's unpack this then. And maybe start at the beginning, or at least the beginning of the story most of us know.
The Paris origin story.
Right. The birth of Cubism is so often tied to that intense, almost singular collaboration between two artistic titans, Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque.
The famous duo.
Their bond during those early years was apparently so profound that Braque famously said, "The things that Picasso and I said to one another during those years will never be said again. It was like being roped together on a mountain."
Wow. That really conveys the intensity, doesn't it? Like a shared mission.
It really does. The sheer intensity and shared revolutionary spirit of their partnership. They truly broke away from that fixed viewpoint, that illusion of 3D space that dominated Western art for so long.
Choosing instead to emphasize the canvas's flatness.
Exactly. Its two-dimensional nature. They did this by breaking objects down into distinct planes, as the theory goes.
To show different points of view at the same time in the same space. Yeah.
So you're kind of presenting the object's three-dimensional form, but also reminding the viewer that, hey, this is a flat canvas.
It's a real mental puzzle sometimes. This move away from traditional perspective was genuinely radical for the time.
And we know they drew inspiration from various places, right?
Yeah.
Paul Cézanne.
Definitely. Cézanne was already experimenting with painting from slightly different viewpoints, sort of paving the way.
And African and oceanic art. Or other non-Western sources.
Yes, hugely important. Picasso especially was deeply inspired by the highly stylized, non-naturalistic African masks he saw.
Didn't he say something about distributing features?
He did, famously stating a head is a matter of eyes, nose, mouth, which can be distributed in any way you like. It was like a declaration of artistic freedom from just copying reality.
Wow, okay.
And that inspiration from Cézanne and non-Western art really helped them forge this entirely new way of seeing and representing. Cubism, as you mentioned, it really evolved through two distinct phases.
Right, phases.
And understanding these is pretty crucial for appreciating how later artists adapted the style. The first phase is what we call analytical cubism.
Analytical. Okay, when was that?
Roughly 1908 to 1912. Artworks from this period, they're characterized by a severe, almost monochromatic palette.
So not much color.
Very little, often just blacks, grays, ochres.
Hmm.
And this muted palette was chosen specifically, they said, so as not to distract the viewer from the structure of the form.
Ah, structure is key.
And the density of the image, usually concentrated at the center of the canvas. The compositions themselves are made up of this intricate interweaving of planes and lines.
Making it hard to see the subject sometimes.
Often, yeah. It can be difficult to distinguish at first glance. A prime example is Georges Braque's Mandora from 1909-1910.
Mandora, okay.
When you look at it, you see these dark, muted tones and densely interweaving planes, all depicting a small lute, but it's so fragmented and reassembled.
That you have to kind of figure it out.
Exactly. The instrument's form is suggested rather than explicitly rendered. The genius here, I think, is that it truly pushes you, the viewer, to piece together the object in your mind. You have to actively engage with the work, not just passively observe.
That makes sense. So that's analytical. What came next?
Then, around 1912, Cubism entered its second phase, synthetic Cubism, which lasted until about 1914, just before the war really kicked off.
Synthetic, how is that different?
Well, visually, it's identifiable by simpler shapes and brighter colors. That's a big shift from the severe, muted palette of analytical Cubism.
So more visually appealing, maybe?
Perhaps. But the real innovation here was the artist's experimentation with textures and patterns, and crucially, the introduction of collage.
Collage. Like sticking things onto the painting.
Exactly. Bits of paper, wallpaper, newspaper. This wasn't just a quirky addition. It was the beginning of one of the most important ideas in modern art. Working with already existing or ready-made objects.
Integrating bits of the real world.
Directly onto the canvas. Think about Picasso's bottle of Umart, glass, guitar, and newspaper from 1913.
Okay, I think I know that one.
Here you start to see lighter blues and whites maybe, and the literal inclusion of pieces of newspaper pasted onto the canvas. It just integrates real-world materials directly into the artwork.
Blurring the lines.
Completely. Blurs the line between painting and reality in a totally new way. Throughout both these phases, Picasso and Braque, they share a common set of motifs in their still lifes.
Things they painted awful.
Yeah, like musical instruments, bottles, pitchers, glasses, newspapers, playing cards, and of course the human face and figure.
Familiar things.
Right. These familiar objects allow them to focus on the radical fragmentation and reassembly without the viewer getting completely lost in, trying to identify some obscure subject.
So the key takeaway from these Paris foundations, it wasn't just a style.
Not at all. It was a profound shift in how artists approached perception, representation, and really the very nature of art itself.
So we've talked about the foundational duo Picasso and Braque and their revolutionary partnership, but as you hinted, Cubism wasn't just a two-person act, was it?
Definitely not. While they were experimenting intensely, sort of behind closed doors in their studios, a wider circle of artists in Paris began to engage with this radical new visual language.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? As others interpreted and evolved the style.
Exactly. Expanding the dialogue beyond those two key figures. We're talking about artists like Fernand Léger, Juan Gris, who we'll definitely get to.
Duchamp, too.
Marcel Duchamp,
Yeah.
Albert Gleizes, and a particularly fascinating figure named Jean Metzinger.
Metzinger. You said he's intriguing. Why specifically?
Well, Metzinger's especially interesting because he not only pushed the artistic boundaries himself, but he also played a pivotal role in helping to explain Cubism to the world. He literally co-wrote the first book on it.
Ah, the theorist as well as the artist.
Indeed. Jean Metzinger was a central figure among what are sometimes called the Salon Cubists.
Salon Cubists, what does that mean?
It just means they were a group that exhibited together in the larger public exhibitions, the salons, making Cubism accessible to a broader audience beyond those initial private circles of Picasso and Braque.
Taking it public.
Exactly. He was a member of the influential group du Puteaux, and notably, he co-organized La Section d'Or, which was the first major public exhibition dedicated to Cubist art in 1912.
Wow, a landmark show.
Absolutely. But perhaps his most significant contribution, as I mentioned, was co-authoring De Cubism on Cubism with Albert Gleizes.
The book you mentioned.
Yes, and it was a seminal text, incredibly important, because it's the only account of early Cubism published by artists who actually had a direct impact on the direction contemporary art would take.
So, from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Pretty much. They weren't just describing what others did. They were shaping the movement's intellectual framework themselves. And in this text, they put forth a powerful philosophical argument.
What was the argument?
They advocated for, and this is a quote, limitless liberty for the artist who abstains from any compromises and does not explain himself or say anything.
Don't explain, just paint.
Essentially. They stated that painting should move, dominate, and direct people rather than to be understood, which was a pretty bold challenge to conventional art aims. Right?
Yeah, usually art is meant to communicate something specific.
Right. They were suggesting art's purpose wasn't simply narrative or representation, but about having this profound, almost visceral impact on the viewer.
Interesting. And what about his artistic innovations? Did he have a specific take?
He did. Metzinger's theory of mobile perspective became quite well known, almost a household name in art circles.
Mobile perspective.
He really delved into the idea that a viewer must be able to study an item concurrently from different perspectives to gain a full understanding. It's this idea of seeing around an object, but on a flat plane.
That sounds quite abstract.
It is, but it even resonated with scientists. It's fascinating to think that the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, a pioneer in quantum physics.
Niels Bohr.
Niels Bohr, yeah. He found such a direct parallel in Metzinger's art. In fact, he kept Metzinger's 1911 painting, La Femme au Cheval Woman, with a horse on his office wall.
No way. Why?
As a reminder, apparently, of the fourth dimension in painting and the functional role the spectator plays in comprehending an artwork.
That's incredible. Art influencing science.
Or at least resonating deeply. And the painting itself, La Femme au Cheval, it depicts a naked woman from several angles simultaneously, illustrating his investigation into this mobile perspective through multiple planes, volumetric shapes, both straight and curved lines.
So it visually demonstrates the theory.
Exactly. It uses a mostly muted color scheme, sensual and earthy tones, though interestingly, with bursts of vivid blue in some flowers, maybe hinting at his later, more liberal use of color.
So the key takeaway with Metzinger, it's about the viewer's role.
Yes, he pushed the philosophical boundaries, arguing that the viewer isn't just a passive observer, but an active participant in constructing meaning from the fragmented reality on the canvas.
And you mentioned color. How did he differ from Picasso and Braque there?
That's another significant innovation. While Picasso and Braque famously avoided what they saw as the frivolity of color in analytical cubism, preferring those muted tones to focus on form.
Right, structure over color.
Metzinger was, and this is a quote again, considerably more receptive to the potential of color as an instrument for depicting visual energy.
Visual energy. So color wasn't just decorative for him.
Not at all. This wasn't a minor tweak. It made cubism, frankly, more approachable to a skeptic general audience who might have found the early monochromatic works too severe or, hard to get into.
Made it less intimidating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It genuinely elevated cubism to a prominent position on the worldwide art scene by making it more visually engaging, more dynamic. His daring use of color, combined with these stunning mosaic illusions he created.
Mosaic illusion?
Yeah, building up the surface with distinct patches of color. It all defined his belief that art should not be an exact copy of reality, but rather a reflection of it. And that reflection could be vibrant and energetic.
Can you give an example of that early color work?
Sure. Take his early work, but Gis. Du nu dans un paysage exotique de dia. Two nudes in an exotic landscape from 1905. It's even before full-blown cubism, but you see the direction.
Okay.
Here you see bold, expressive fauvisque colors, warm reds, blues, greens, oranges used in the background, contrasting with the more natural tones of the figures.
Fauvisque like Matisse.
Similar, vibrant, non-naturalistic color, yeah. And the composition itself is divisionist.
Divisionist, like Seurat with the dots.
Sort of, using tiny, distinct brushstrokes of pure color to build up the image, letting your eye blend them from a distance. He also used impasto, really thick paint, applied directly, forming this mosaic-like pattern.
But different from Seurat's goal.
Yes, unlike Seurat's divisionist paintings, which often aimed to create depth, Metzinger's mosaics tended to flatten the foregrounds and backgrounds, creating a new, dynamic visual language that still respected the canvas's flatness.
That's a powerful distinction, using color as an instrument for energy, making cubism more accessible. And then you mentioned him earlier as an amalgamator. What did you mean by that? What was he blending?
Absolutely. He was quite the masterful synthesis, wasn't he? Blending ideas from different avant-garde movements that were happening around the same time.
Like cubism plus something else.
Exactly. His work, O Velodrome, at the Velodrome from 1912, is often described as an amalgamator of the innovations of Cubism and Futurism.
Futurism, the Italian movement. Obsessed with speed.
That's the one. Speed, technology, the dynamism of modern life. Metzinger took the Cubist fragmentation, the multiple viewpoints, the geometric planes, and layered it with that futurist energy.
How does that look in the painting?
Well, the painting depicts the winner of the 1912 Paris-Roubaix bicycle race, a guy named Charles Croupeland. You see the cyclist leaning over the handlebars, But remarkably, the crowds are visible through his figure.
Through him? How?
Due to a subtle transparency, almost as if his form is vibrating with speed, becoming permeable. And there's even another racer's spinning rear wheel just sort of visible at the edge, all contributing to this vivid sense of urgency and motion.
Wow, that's a really clever fusion. Capturing movement through static forms.
It's a remarkable fusion, yeah.
Yeah.
Cubist structure with a feeling of exhilarating velocity, really trying to paint the modern age.
That's incredible, the mobile perspective, integrating vibrant color, infusing dynamism. So what happened to Metzinger's style after these initial breakthroughs? Did he stick with that, or did it evolve further?
Well, it definitely continued to evolve, particularly after World War I. That conflict was a huge rupture for everyone. Afterwards, he contributed to a style sometimes known as crystal cubism.
Crystal cubism. Sounds different.
It was a departure, yeah. It featured bigger overlapping and intertwining geometric surfaces, with a renewed focus on flat surfaces and overlapping planes in a simplified version of cubism.
Simplified. Why?
It's often seen as a move towards clarity and order after the chaos of the war, a kind of purification or distillation of form, less fragmentation, more structure.
And this connected to his ideas about math.
Deeply connected, he famously wrote to Glazes in 1916, "The geometry of the fourth space has no more secrets for me. Everything is number."
Everything is number. Wow.
He saw all lasting art as never anything more than a mathematical expression of the relations that exist between what is inside and what is outside, the self and the world. That intellectual rigor was absolutely central to his artistic philosophy. For him, art wasn't just about feeling, it was about expressing these universal mathematical truths.
But despite all this, you said art history was sometimes cruel to him.
It's arguably true. There's been a tendency, perhaps, to overemphasize Picasso and Braque as the sole architects of Cubism, overshadowing other key figures like Metzinger.
Which isn't really fair, given his contributions.
Exactly. The art historian Daniel Robbins rightly argued that Metzinger's work should be analyzed on his own ideas and methods, rather than always being compared to the work of artists outside his immediate group.
Judge him on his own terms.
Right. And similarly, Richard West cautioned against seeing deviations from the Picasso-Braque style as some kind of misunderstanding or a lesser form of Cubism.
Which really speaks to the broader point of our deep dive today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Cubism wasn't this monolithic style, but rather fertile ground for diverse interpretations. Metzinger powerfully demonstrated its adaptability and its intellectual depth.
So we've seen how Metzinger took Cubism's core ideas and expanded them with theory, color, dynamism. He showed it wasn't just about breaking down forms, but rebuilding them with philosophical intent. But if he was exploring how we see reality in new ways, what about the underlying structure of these fractured worlds? Our next artist, Juan Gris, offers an astonishing answer, bringing a level of mathematical precision that really redefined what a fragmented world could look like.
Oh, Gris. Yes.
He's often called the classical cubist, even a perfect painter, terms that immediately suggest a contrast to the perceived, maybe, wildness or ad hoc nature of Picasso and Braque's fragmentation.
There's definitely a sense of order in his work.
It's also interesting his pseudonym, Juan Gris, literally means John Gray, which seems ironically and perhaps intentionally at odds with his uniquely colorful Cubist paintings, doesn't it? Maybe hinting at his dual identity, Spanish and French.
That's a nice observation. And what's truly fascinating about Gris is how he differentiated himself. While Picasso and Braque often disassembled objects in a way that felt quite intuitive, maybe ad hoc.
More spontaneous.
You could say that. Gris, starting around 1910, actively sought a larger coherent structure. He rooted Cubist innovations in compositional traditions of symmetry.
Symmetry. In Cubism, that seems contradictory.
It does at first glance,
Yeah.
but it made his work uniquely organized and visually distinct. Remember, Cubism fundamentally challenged that Renaissance idea of the painting as a window onto a 3D space.
Right, the impossible construction.
It created an impossible 2D construction of objects and spaces that cannot exist in 3D, where solid objects fuse with empty space and figure-ground distinctions, the separation of object from background, start to break down.
Okay.
Gris didn't shy away from this disruption. Instead, he layered geometric clarity onto it. He made these impossible spaces feel incredibly resolved, almost harmonically composed.
So he found order in the chaos.
Or maybe imposed a new kind of order. The key insight with Gris is that he showed Cubism wasn't just about breaking reality down. It was about rebuilding it with a new internal logic. He proved that even fractured forms could adhere to a beautiful, almost poetic mathematical order.
How did he do that? What were his methods?
Well, Gris was truly exceptional among Cubists, and even earlier painters, because he systematically employed various forms of symmetry transformations to organize his fragmented compositions.
Symmetry transformations? Like in geometry class?
Kind of, yes. This wasn't something commonly used in fine art back then. It was usually relegated to decorative arts, like textiles or architectural patterns. He elevated it to a high art form.
Okay, so what kinds of symmetry?
Well, one of his key approaches, particularly around 1913, involved the kind of visual echoing.
Echoing?
Imagine looking at a still life, and then you see parts of the same objects appear again, but subtly shifted or mirrored, almost as if the canvas itself is folding and unfolding in front of you.
Huh.
Gris used this method, which art historians sometimes call rotational symmetry transformations, to disassemble not just individual objects, but groups of objects, and sometimes even whole scenes.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Consider his 1914 painting Flowers. It's a fragmented still life flowers in a vase, newspaper, cup and saucer, wine glass, pipe, bottle, marble tabletop. Classic Cubist stuff. But curiously, you see 2 cups, 2 saucers, 2 vases. One set is upright, vertical. The other set is tilted, but parallel to the first.
So repeated objects?
In effect, yes. They are 2 views of the same objects, offset by a rotation, creating this visual rhythm, this echo.
That's clever.
And what's really clever is that the tilted images often carry the object's shape and shading information, but not its texture or coloration.
What does that do visually?
It leads to these superimpositions and surprising recombinations. You might see what looks like a marble cup or a marble vase, because the texture of the marble tabletop gets superimposed onto the rotated shape of the cup or vase.
Ah, see, a visual mashup.
Exactly. And you also sometimes see empty black spaces where texture is absent, creating a reversal of figure and ground, where solid objects seem to dissolve into empty space, or space seems to become solid.
So it forces you to engage actively.
It forces you, the viewer, to engage with a perceptual motion through the 2D composition of the painting, integrating a sense of movement within the artwork itself. It's like perceiving objects from various angles without actually moving your head.
Okay, that's rotational symmetry. What else did he use?
His next development, emerging around 1917, involved a more dynamic form of mirroring. Simple reflective symmetry, like a perfect mirror image, can sometimes look a bit static, right?
Yeah, a bit flat.
So Gris's solution was to combine reflection with changes in proportion, scale, or position to introduce dynamism. This technique is often called reflective symmetry transformations with translation, or sometimes glide reflection.
Reflection plus movement.
Basically.
Yeah.
His fruit bowl on checkered cloth from 1917, though it looks abstract and maybe asymmetrical at first glance, is a brilliant example.
Okay, what's happening there?
You see a tilted checkered tablecloth, a cup, the base of a fruit dish at the center that seems fragmented, but actually a large number of shapes in the bottom half of the canvas are symmetrically related to the top half by a subtle combination of reflection and a slight shift, a translation. The strongest clue for this is the apparent similarity between the checkered cloth below and the grapes above.
Cloth and the grapes.
Yeah, where the ovals of the grapes fitting neatly in each of the rectangles of the checked cloth, almost like a visual pun, creating this subtle, moving symmetry that feels alive, not rigid or static.
That's really subtle. Okay, what next?
Then, around 1921, he expanded this idea to reflective symmetry transformations with enlargement reduction.
So mirroring, but changing the size.
Exactly. He incorporated reflective transformations with dilation, meaning one side of the symmetry would be larger than the other, creating a sense of growth or recession within the symmetrical structure.
And this connected to math, too.
Yes. Interestingly, this even tied into the phi ratio, the golden section that mathematical proportion found in nature and art, considered aesthetically pleasing. His dealer, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, actually acknowledged Gris employed these divisions.
Wow. Can we see this in a painting?
A clear illustration is Le Canigou from 1921. Le Canigou is a mountain in the Pyrenees, visible from where he was staying.
Okay.
The painting depicts a still life guitar, book, fruit on a plate, set on a table before an open window, showing snow-capped mountains and blue sky.
A classic setup.
But the composition reveals remarkable symmetries. For instance, the shape and angle of the large window shutter at the right is reflected in the smaller and darker shape of the table at the far left.
A reflection across the painting, but different sizes.
Exactly. Similarly, the undulating shape of the white mountains above is mirrored in the smaller shape of the side of the guitar below. There's a clear vertical division from top to bottom, slightly left of center, which serves as the central axis of a reflective symmetry.
And the size changes across this axis.
Yes. The shapes at the lower left are smaller versions of shapes at the right. And this vertical division itself is consistent with the phi division of the overall rectangle, adding to the painting's underlying mathematical harmony and sense of deliberate construction.
It's like architectural planning, almost.
There's definitely a sense of structure. And finally, in the last 3 years of his life, from 1924 to 1927, Gris developed yet another innovative approach: diagonal axis reflective symmetry transformations with proportional change.
Diagonal axes now.
Yes, using diagonal axes, which, when applied to rectangular canvases, naturally resulted in differently proportioned symmetrical shapes because the diagonal cuts across sides of different lengths.
Making the symmetry respond to the canvas shape?
Precisely. His Woman with a Basket from 1927 offers an elegantly simple example. It's composed of just over half a dozen large, flat shapes of color, forming a woman in a tunic holding a basket.
Simple forms?
Very. But a diagonal axis running from the lower left to the upper right divides the shapes and lines into a reflective symmetry. The white tunic, combined with the green leaves and red fruit, form a symmetrical arrow shape.
Okay.
But it's proportionally squeezed or stretched by the canvas dimensions. The warmer, flesh tone and earthy colored shapes on the left side of the axis are symmetrically matched by the brown shape in the basket on the right.
But proportioned differently.
Right. They are proportionally narrower horizontally than they are vertically, reflecting the overall shape of the canvas. It demonstrates a symmetry that's both geometrically precise and naturally responsive to the specific shape of the compositional space. Makes a complex idea look effortless.
It's astounding how systematically he approached this. He really brought an intellectual rigor to Cubism that's truly unique. It's like he was building a whole new grammar for perception.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean for his artistic philosophy and his legacy? How did he see his own groundbreaking methods?
Well, it means that Gris's methods went way beyond just visual trickery. They were deeply philosophical for him. He saw his symmetry transformations as visual equivalents to poetry.
Poetry? How so?
Where shapes are ordered by a geometric meter and echo one another in visual rhymes. He wasn't just fragmenting, he was composing with this meticulous, almost musical precision.
That's a beautiful analogy.
And he famously articulated this himself, drawing a profound distinction between his work and the maybe more analytical approach of his predecessors. He said, "Cézanne turns a bottle into a cylinder.
Okay.
But I begin with a cylinder and create an individual of a special type. I make a particular bottle out of a cylinder. This painting is to the other, as poetry is to prose."
Wow. So he saw himself as synthesizing, creating specifics from general forms.
Exactly. It highlights his intellectual rigor and unique creative process. He was constructing a specific, unique reality from abstract forms, rather than just analyzing and deconstructing existing ones. He was building, not just breaking.
That's a key difference. But you said he never gained the same fame as Picasso.
Sadly, no. He never gained the notoriety or status of Picasso, but his originality was recognized and deeply defended by influential figures like Kahnweiler, his dealer, and the renowned writer Gertrude Stein.
What did Stein say?
She unequivocally stated, "The only real Cubism is that of Picasso and Juan Gris. Picasso created it, and Juan Gris permeated it with his clarity and his exaltation." High praise.
That's huge. So his legacy is about that clarity and order within Cubism.
Very much so. His work truly embodies the enduring, traditional visual language of symmetry, but expressed with a modern voice in the idiom of Cubism. He proved that order could be found, and even created, within the most fractured of worlds.
Okay, so we've seen how Cubism evolved within the vibrant artistic circles of Paris Metzinger, pushing its theoretical and colorful boundaries. Gris bringing this incredible mathematical order. These interpretations were deeply rooted in those Parisian intellectual currents. But what happens when a revolutionary idea travels, not just across the city, but across borders and cultures, when it meets different philosophical traditions, different historical contexts?
Yeah, how does it adapt?
Let's journey beyond Paris now, eastward to Czechoslovakia, where Cubism found a surprisingly fertile ground for unique development.
Czech Cubism. Very distinct.
Right. Here, the creative dialogue between Paris and Czechoslovakia wasn't one of simple imitation, was it?
Not at all. Czech artists, in fact, never simply imitated the Parisian style, but developed their own forms of Cubism. And notably, they were much more open to embracing elements of Expressionism and Symbolism.
Expressionism and Symbolism. So more emotion, more hidden meanings.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how a global idea becomes truly localized and personally meaningful when it travels.
So what were the distinct features of Czech Cubism? How did it differ?
Well, as you touched on, the Czech adaptation introduced some features that really set it apart. Unlike its more formal, sometimes purely analytical, Parisian counterpart, Czech Cubism opened the field to approach religious and mythological subject matter.
Religious themes. That's quite different from Picasso and Braque's guitars and newspapers.
It was very different. This was a significant shift, infusing those geometric forms with spiritual and symbolic meaning that was deeply rooted in Czech culture and history.
And how did they handle the Cubist style itself?
Well, importantly, in a typically Cubist manner, they went beyond reason by freely merging elements of a subject from different angles, just like the Parisians.
Okay.
But doing so left room for the imagination of both artist and viewer to play their part, especially with these more spiritual themes. This added a layer of symbolic depth that wasn't as prevalent in the early Paris works, allowing Cubism to become a vehicle for profound cultural expression.
Who were some of the key figures in Czech Cubism?
One of the undisputed pioneers was Emil Filla.
Filla. Okay.
He actually spent crucial pre-war years, from 1911 to 1914, in Paris. He visited Picasso and Braque's studios.
So he saw the source directly.
Absolutely. He certainly would have seen iconic works like Picasso's Bottles and Glasses from 1911, 1912, and he clearly found much inspiration for the huge Cubist oeuvre he would create throughout the rest of his life in Czechoslovakia.
But his work changed later.
It did. Phil's journey took a profound turn after enduring the catastrophes of 2 world wars. I mean, living through that, it changes you. This intense period profoundly influenced his artistic vision, making him open to more spiritual subjects and approaches, reflecting the deep societal and personal shifts he experienced.
Can you give an example of his later work?
His Seated Woman, painted much later in 1948, powerfully demonstrates this evolution. It shows the development of Cubism from the sharp outlines of the subject to the flowing forms and further abstraction.
Flowing forms. So, less angular.
Less rigidly geometric, perhaps more organic within the abstraction. Her figure, notably, wears no clothes at all, posing confidently, looking us right in the eye. The distortion of her body is quite pronounced.
Still Cubist distortion.
Oh yes, a deliberate manipulation of form, but perhaps to convey more of an inner reality. And apart from some small details like red lipstick, nail varnish, and a single rose, the color choices are decidedly non-natural.
Expressive color again.
Showcasing a move towards greater expressive abstraction in his later work. The artwork feels less about optical truth and more about a deeply felt psychological and perhaps spiritual state.
Interesting. Who else was important?
Then there's František Foltýn, another significant figure who truly transformed his artistic style throughout his life.
Foltýn, okay.
He created some of the finest Czech Cubist works early on at the Kouši Artists Colony, which was this vibrant center of artistic innovation in eastern Slovakia, then part of Czechoslovakia.
But he changed later.
Radically. He would become one of the country's leading abstractionists, demonstrating this continuous evolution. His visit to Paris in 1924, which was a decade after Filla's crucial period there, exposed him to fellow Czech painter František Kupka.
Another abstraction pioneer.
Exactly. And also to the anti-narrative tendencies. They were more in vogue in France by then, this move away from art that simply tells a story, towards art exploring form, color, emotion for their own sake.
So Foltýn embraced that abstraction more fully.
Eventually, yes. But his masterpiece, Blue Madonna, painted between 1922 and 1924, just before that Paris trip, really exemplifies the unique spiritual dimension of early Czech Cubism.
Blue Madonna. What's it like?
It depicts a calm scene of a mother and child enthroned in the countryside of his homeland. She sits tall, eyes cast down, adorned in this fantastically modernist blue dress. Very striking.
And symbolic elements.
Oh yes, they abound. Trees and clouds form a royal baldachin above them, and the 3 mountaintops in the background could symbolize the presence of the Holy Trinity. It's layered with meaning.
And style, still Cubist.
Yes, but perhaps with more defined forms than Filla's later work. This painting, with its sharp outlines of the subject, offers a compelling contrast to Filla's later, more flowing style. It illustrates the different paths Cubism could take, even within the same cultural context.
That's a fascinating progression. I'm curious about that visual shift between Filla's Seated Woman and Foltýn's Blue Madonna. How do they visually represent that evolution, given their different periods and intentions?
Well, if you compare Filla's Seated Woman from 48 with Foltýn's Blue Madonna from 22-24, you can really see the progression of Cubism in 2 Czech masterworks, even though they were painted decades apart. Foltýn's Blue Madonna, the earlier work, it still retains those sharp outlines in the subject. It emphasizes defined forms, despite the Cubist fragmentation and multiple viewpoints. The focus is on a calm, almost monumental spiritual figure, rendered with a clarity that still honors the subject's iconic status.
So sharp but fragmented.
Right. Whereas Filla's seated woman, painted about 25 years later, shows a clear move towards flowing forms and further abstraction. The lines are less rigid, less angular. The body is much more distorted than Foltýn's Madonna.
More extreme distortion.
And the colors, as we said, are deliberately non-natural, chosen for expressive rather than descriptive purposes. It's as if Cubism, for Filla, became a vehicle for even greater expressive freedom, a deeper plunge into the abstract representation of the human form.
Reflecting his experiences, perhaps.
Reflecting his openness to spiritual subjects and the profound impact of the world wars he endured, exactly. And there's even a striking cross-cultural echo.
With Picasso.
Yes. Similarities between Filla's seated woman and Picasso's portrait, Dora Maar Osho, both painted in the 1940s. In both paintings, the women really command the picture plane, powerfully positioned while seated in front of or in a chair.
So a shared visual language.
Demonstrating how a shared Cubist vocabulary could lead to similar powerful compositions, even across national boundaries, yet each infused with unique cultural and personal meaning.
We've seen Cubism cross Europe now, from Paris to Czechoslovakia, evolving in these fascinating, deeply personal ways, embracing spiritual and symbolic dimensions. But what about its journey even further east? Prepare for, I think, another real aha moment as we discover how an artist on the Indian subcontinent not only adopted Cubism, but completely reimagined it through his own unique cultural lens.
Ah, yes, a truly unique story.
Leading to another groundbreaking adaptation. I'm talking about Gaganendranath Tagore.
Gaganendranath Tagore, yes.
Who is recognized as the earliest proponent of Cubism in India, a painter and cartoonist of the influential Bengal school of art.
And Tagore's assimilation of Cubism was truly unique. He never strictly followed the Cubist art style as it was practiced in Europe. He didn't just copy it.
He blended it.
He blended it with his own style, which was already far from the traditional Indian type of art. His genius, I think, lay in his ability to see the core principles of Cubism that resonated with his own artistic vision and, importantly, the needs of Indian art at that specific time.
What did he see in Cubism?
Well, he agreed with the simplicity and stark essentials of Cubism, that reduction to geometric forms. But crucially, he realized that light and space, as expressive values, had never been used in Indian painting before.
Light and space weren't traditional focuses.
Not in the same way as in Western art, no. For centuries, Indian art focused more on line, color, narrative, less on the atmospheric interplay of light and spatial dynamics. This was a profound insight on his part.
So his mission became
to combine structure, stark simplicity of form, light, space, and surface design in a coherent whole, never achieved by any Indian painter this far. He wasn't just looking for a new style, he was looking for a new language to convey a distinctly Indian sensibility of light and space using Cubist tools.
What was his artistic journey like before Cubism?
Well, Tagore's career had several phases, each bearing a particular style. He started with expressive Calcutta scenes and landscapes from about 1905 to 1911, capturing the life of his city.
Okay.
Then came his Chaitanya series, 1911-1915, focusing on the spiritual leader Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, showing his early interest in spiritual themes.
And then Cubism.
Then his most significant period for our discussion, the Vichitra period, from roughly 1915 to 1921, which consisted of his Cubist experiments. And his post-Cubist paintings continued until 1930.
What were his influences before Europe?
Interestingly, he was initially influenced by Japanese artists like Okakura, who actually encouraged a return to indigenous artistic traditions, not Western ones. And Tagore even began his first series with crows with Chinese ink and brush.
Chinese ink. So diverse influences early on.
Demonstrating his openness to diverse Asian art forms from the start. This deep background in traditional Asian art, plus his openness to other styles, positioned him uniquely to reinterpret Cubism.
Not as an alien import.
But as a tool for new expression within an Indian context.
That's remarkable, not just adopting Cubism, but truly synthesizing it with existing traditions and introducing entirely new concepts for Indian art, like the expressive use of light and space. But if he was such a pioneer, bridging these philosophies in such a groundbreaking way, why isn't he as widely known, maybe, as some of the European Cubists?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Was there controversy surrounding his work, perhaps related to the nationalist art movement in India at the time?
You've hit on a crucial point about his relative obscurity and, yes, the controversy. His early Cubist paintings were recognized initially, They were reproduced in Rupam in 1922, a prominent art journal.
Okay, so he wasn't ignored completely.
Not initially. That publication included Stella Kramrisch's groundbreaking article titled An Indian Cubist. And reviewers in the 1920s did refer to his work as Cubist. He was recognized. But his genius was somewhat overshadowed by the towering personality of his uncle, Rabindranath Tagore.
The Nobel laureate poet.
Exactly.
That's cool.
As well as by his younger brother, Gaganendranath Tagore, who's also a key painter in the Bengal school, but whose life and work are better documented and perhaps more traditionally aligned with the school's aims.
So overshadowed by family.
And perhaps, as one writer put it, he was perhaps too radical a thinker to be appreciated in his time as well as ours by the mainstream art establishment.
And the nationalist debate, how did that play out?
Yes, his Cubist work sparked a significant nationalist debate. They became a major issue for some critics who debated over the validity of this influence on an Indian artist in light of the nationalist art movement in the form of the Bengal school,
Which Tagore himself was part of.
he was a foundational part. This movement was actively trying to define a distinctly Indian modern art, often by rejecting perceived Western influences.
So adopting a European style like Cubism.
Was seen by some as an unwelcome encroachment, almost a betrayal of the nationalist cause.
But he had defenders.
Oh yes, strong defenders of his eclectic approach. Dinesh Chandra Sen, a prominent literary figure, pointed out that Tagore actively participated in replacing European paintings with indigenous artifacts, including Mughal and Rajput paintings, in their family drawing rooms,
Showing his respect for Indian tradition.
proving his deep roots and respect for Indian art. He wasn't just blindly copying, he was integrating selectively.
Who else defended him?
Nandalal Bose, a contemporary and another major artist at the Bengal school, was quite comfortable with Gaganendranath's Cubist take.
What did Bose say?
Bose famously wrote that Tagore was inspired by the experimentalist art of modern Europe, but it did not sweep him off his feet.
He kept his balance.
Indeed, his later paintings are splendid examples of how fresh forms and moods can be created through a complete assimilation of the alien and the familiar.
Assimilation, not imitation.
By emphasizing this assimilation, Bose was openly declaring his faith in eclecticism, basically arguing that true artistic strength comes from the ability to absorb and transform, not just reject.
What about Stella Kramrisch, the historian who wrote about him?
Right, Kramrisch, an American art historian specializing in Indian art, she acknowledged that Indian Cubism as a paradox because of that nationalist context.
Okay.
But she asserted that Tagore successfully reinvented Cubism by evoking and then tracing formal tendencies. She argued that Cubism's simplicity wasn't fundamentally unique from other non-illusionist art forms prevalent in Asia.
Connecting it to existing traditions.
And crucially, that Tagore's already simplistic style using light and space worked well with the Cubist style. This really highlights that his unique artistic sensibility prepared him to integrate Cubism as a tool rather than merely copy it as a trend.
So it sounds like he took the core ideas of Cubism, breaking forms, multiple perspectives, and then filtered them through his own unique vision, particularly with that expressive use of light and space, creating something entirely new and culturally resonant.
That's a perfect summary.
What did that unique vision look like on the canvas? Can you paint a picture of how his Cubism manifested visually?
Well, his Cubism wasn't, as some might accuse European Cubists of, a purposeless cerebral exercise or about making a cult of geometry for its own sake. It had a different feel.
How so?
Instead, his work used geometrical patterns to produce this profound kaleidoscopic effect of light. He really focused on glimmering rays to be deflected from faceted pillars, pyramids, and prisms, and then to be swallowed up by semi-lucent or total darkness.
Kaleidoscopic light. That sounds amazing.
Imagine light catching on fragmented surfaces, bouncing and refracting, creating this dynamic interplay of illumination and shadow, often with deep, mysterious, dark areas.
And the subject matter. Still life?
Less often. His vision often soared from the hustle and bustle of the urban scene into a dreamland where he could curtain off everything that was brutal and ugly and focus an eerie light on some flight of steps, on the courtyards and perhaps of a castle, or on the palace of a fairy princess.
Dreamland, so more fantastical.
Much more fantastical, almost mystical at times. This imagination often placed him, the artist, in the role of a protagonist within his own dreamscapes.
Like he was exploring these worlds.
Exactly. He imagined himself as a lone rider of a black horse and visit forbidden castles or palaces of snow, or he would set out on a voyage in a dreamboat in quest of far unknown lands beyond the sea.
That's incredibly poetic. Can we see this in specific works?
Absolutely. You can see this fantastical, almost ethereal quality in works like Destruction of Dwarka, which uses geometric planes to evoke the dramatic collapse of a mythological city from the Mahabharata.
Using Cubism for myth.
Or the striking cover he designed for his uncle Rabindranath's play, Raktakarbi, or Red Oleanders, which uses fragmented forms and that play of light and dark to convey the play's themes of confinement and rebellion.
Wow.
These works powerfully demonstrate how he used the Cubist vocabulary not for objective deconstruction of reality, but to construct these internal, almost fantastical realities. He combined structure, stark simplicity, light, space, and surface design in a cohesive way that truly hadn't been seen in Indian painting before.
Bridging artistic philosophy.
In a profoundly original and compelling manner. This was Cubism infused with the spirit of Indian myth and dreamscapes, transforming it into something utterly new.
So we started with the iconic figures of Picasso and Braque, confined, it seemed, to their intense Parisian laboratory, defining Cubism for the world.
The standard story.
But what we've discovered on this deep dive is a truly vibrant global conversation around Cubism. It's so clear that a truly revolutionary idea doesn't just replicate, it inspires profound reinvention.
Takes on new life.
Exactly. It takes on new life and meaning in different contexts. From the theoretical rigor and surprising use of color by Jean Metzinger,
And the astounding mathematical elegance and structural precision brought by Juan Gris,
to the spiritual and nationalist interpretations that flourished in Czechoslovakia with Emil, Filla, and František Foltýn.
and finally, that utterly reimagined style in India through Gaganendranath Tagore.
Cubism became this flexible framework for endless artistic expression, far, far beyond its Parisian birthplace. What stands out to you after hearing about all these artists who took Cubism and really made it uniquely their own?
What's really fascinating here, I think, is how Cubism's core idea,
Yeah.
breaking down perception into multiple viewpoints, wasn't just a technique for art. It became a powerful metaphor for understanding the world itself.
Seeing things from different angles.
Exactly. These artists, whether they did it through geometry or spirituality or cultural assimilation, they showed us that true knowledge, true understanding, often comes from seeing things from different angles, both literally and metaphorically.
Moving beyond a single perspective.
Right. The original Cubist impulse in Paris was to challenge centuries of fixed perspective, pushing viewers to question how they see. But the artists we've discussed today, they took that challenge and applied it to their own cultural, philosophical, and personal contexts.
They didn't just mimic the style.
No. They interrogated the very idea of fragmented reality and rebuilt it in a way that spoke to their unique experiences and truths. They made it their own.
Think about how these individual interpretations, often born from personal experience or deep cultural context, enriched a global movement, expanding its very definition. It really broadened what Cubism could be.
It really did. And it raises an important question for all of us, doesn't it? When you're faced with a complex idea or problem, whether it's in art or science or just daily life, what new angles can you apply?
What assumptions might need breaking down?
Exactly. What unexpected combinations of existing elements or what new connections might reveal a deeper truth? The legacy of Cubism isn't just in those fragmented forms on a canvas, is it? It's in its profound invitation to continually re-examine and redefine how we perceive, how we understand, and how we create.
A call to question our own perspectives.
It's a powerful reminder, I think, that revolutionary ideas, when they're truly embraced and thoughtfully transformed, rarely stay confined to their origins. They inspire, they travel, they push the boundaries of what's possible. Much like a lone rider on a black horse visiting forbidden castles of snow, daring to dream new realities into being.